speaking of that, this is totally off topic, but it reminds me of something amazing that I saw. I was watching some YouTube videos and an ad came up for I forget what its name was even, so I'm not trying to dodge, but it was for a private college or for-profit college somewhere in my area, right? Mm-hmm. And it was basically like a tech school kind of thing / community college, like that sort of level. You know, you get your 4-year degree there in some things, but it's mostly like a technical education. But what they really talked up the whole ad, which was about 2.5 to 3 minutes long, something like this. This was a longer one. Was all about how the university and the institution instills discipline, good work habits, professionalism, dress code shit. And it had a bunch of like bosses and shit in the promos, like, you know, yeah, the graduates I've hired from this university, you know, they show up on time, they're always dressed well, you know, they know what's expected of them in the workplace. Like literally, they're just talking up not what you'll learn there, not what you'll learn how to do, but that the students there will learn to show up to their wage slave jobs on time. Mm-hmm. The way they leaned on it so hard, it was really creepy. I mean, even when I went to school, that was not how schools were pitched to me when I was graduating from high school and in my early 20s. I feel like that is explicitly, I mean, it's not a new concept. I'm sure any anarchist listeners will like chime in and be like, no, we've been on this beat for a while, and I get that, but I feel like this particular manifestation in like its brazenness is it's creepy to me, and I don't like it at all.
Yeah, me neither. It makes, so we talk a lot about, I guess not we, but I do talk a lot about automation, especially having come from like the more like Silicon Valley aspect of like digital media, and doing the whole like hybrid. They talk a lot about automation, and, you know, Andrew Yang talked about, you know, automation and like why we need UBI and whatnot. But like we fail to forget that like we try to automate humans by doing this kind of uniformity and like having this kind of like management.
Yeah, it isn't just that we replace labor with machine technology. We mechanize human beings in a way. And I did a podcast a long time ago about Taylorism. The guy who invented the concept of scientific management today is not, it's not viewed very positively or whatever, but it still has its stands, and a lot of things that workplaces do in terms of like monitoring productivity, they would call it that they have their origins in Taylorism, which was, you know, a beginning of the Industrial Revolution phenomenon. Yeah, this is a problem that we'll have to deal with as a species, among others. But
yeah,
we should probably I should probably formally introduce my guest and get to the topic that I actually wanted to talk to them about. Folks, with me right now is Dominique Remy. She's a documentarian and a filmmaker working on a project called the Canary Film Project. It is specifically about, I would say, maternity mortality rates, which might seem a little bit of a narrow topic, but it is a good lens through which to examine societal inequalities, structural inequalities, and the ideologies that have come out of the material conditions that have resulted over the past, say, I don't know, 100 years or so, but, you know, we can quibble about when and where exactly the process accelerates. But before we get started personally, I just want to say, Dominique, thank you very much for being on the Distant Peasant Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
It is absolutely my pleasure. So we talked a little bit off mic about where we were going to start, and we were kind of all over the place because You know, we could literally start 1619 if we wanted to.
Yeah.
We could go to the Civil War, and we may touch on some of that stuff. But actually, I want to bring up something that I looked at after our conversation, which was just a very simple graph of maternal mortality rates over the last, I think it was 4 years. I think it started in 80, the chart started in 87 or something like that to 2014. And it lists them not by race, but just overall. And it lists them deaths per 100,000. And in the 1980s, you can clearly see that it's actually at its lowest in that graph, right in the middle of the Reagan presidency. But as time goes on, that line steadily increases, and it continues to go up. The second chart that I looked at broke it down by race. And what is amazing about that is that the overall maternity rate is pretty low. It could be better. It would be better if we had universal health care in this country, but it's pretty low. And even the non-Black but non-white, i.e. all other racial minorities in the United States, is not too much higher than the white rate. But the female Black maternity rate is literally, I think it was something like 4 to 5 times consistently as high over time as the white rate, and about 3 times higher than the overall rate, or something like this. The disparity was absolutely striking to see, and it was very consistent. And if you were to ask people, why is this? Simply, why is this the case? I think you'd get a lot of answers, but I'll just ask you, Dominique, why is that the case?
So that is actually the point of the film, is to, I would say, lead an investigation as to why is this, but a really good working hypothesis, I would say, is it's a multitude of things. I think it's really interesting that you bring up that chart, and I personally, in my own research, have thought about the rates and the correlation between austerity cuts, or the beginning, middle, and end, and lasting legacy of the war on welfare and cutting down welfare that started with, I want to say, even as early as President, what's his name? The Great Society president. What's his name?
Johnson.
Johnson. There you go. So with all these like wars on drugs and poverty and crime, and then also wanting to cut social safety nets, and like the communities most affected by that across the board have been Black. So I it's really interesting that you bring that up, because that's like one of the things that I want to actually follow in the film, and I thankfully have an economist on board as well, to really like talk more in depth about like the role austerity plays in these kinds of things that lead to like really poor health outcomes. And so one of the things that I say when we are saying we're investigating like the why, it's through looking at social determinants. And the social determinants of health are what's happening in society, as well as what is happening economically, that impact quality of care. So yeah.
My mind first went to because maternity rates generally across races have been climbing.
Mm-hmm.
My first thought was to look for not first for factors that have caused specifically Black maternal mortality rates to skyrocket, which is also a worthy question for sure. But because maternity rates overall have also gone up, it seems to me that the causes will probably be more overarching and structural, and just happen to hit communities that are historically the victims of white supremacy and the descendants of slavery, both literally and like societally, culturally in America. And I would say that, you know, over that time period from the late 80s to the 2010s, you've seen increasing declines in union membership. Wages have continued to go flat. Healthcare costs have continued to go way, way, way up. And they've begun pricing more and more people out of decent health insurance. At the same time, Lyndon Johnson kind of gets stuck as far as he can go with his Great Society. Nixon comes along, Carter comes along, there is no expansion. And then Reagan comes along, and there's not only not an expansion, but we're going to begin the process of dismantling all of the welfare state. And I think these things take time, both materially and like ideologically, to like crystallize. But today we're in a spot where if you were to take, say, Georgia, where they just did a story on this on Friday that I listened to on our local GPB political roundup. And they talked about maternity rates in Georgia skyrocketing, specifically among Black people. And they didn't do a great job. But one thing that they did remember to mention is that, you know, we did have the option to take Medicaid expansion a few years ago. That would have covered millions of more Georgians. We decided not to do that, not because there was any real problem with doing so, but because we had the people in charge had an ideological opposition to that. And that ideology, which has its roots in the fantasy of a small government conservative in previous years, has come home to roost, and it kills people. It does. It kills people.
Yes, precisely. It's great that you brought that up, because in my mind, I wanted to go into those states, particularly the states in the South that refuse to expand Medicaid, and see those rates. Health has been poor across the board, but when you really zero in on maternity care, it's just like manufactured. You can already see that this is something that didn't need to happen in terms of mortality. And that's kind of the reason why I wanted to take up this project, because kind of like you were saying, you know, I wanted to look into the answers, or like look into like just why. My instinct, and this has to do with some kind of conditioning of like what we perceive, or how we perceive Black people in this country. And also, as a Black woman, I'm not immune to this, but I was just like, well, there's something going on with, I guess, like Black bodies, or just like Black community. And you know that narrative about like, it's a cultural thing, you know, like very Charles Murray-esque. Not that I'm saying I was that particularly, but there was something in my mind that was like, I want to look into what particularly about the race leads to these outcomes, and very quickly realize like, no, I don't think it's something that's internal. Like it's like in turning out, it's more out turning in. And Black people in particularly live under structures that are inherently antagonistic, if not outright anti-Black, because they were built on trying to keep Black people out. So,
and I think specifically that the language that I was talking about small government conservatives and wanting to reduce the government's involvement in promoting the general welfare of its population. I think a lot of people on the left generally, but liberals probably especially, I'd say. Sorry to shit on liberals all the time. That's kind of what I do here. I'm a socialist. is that they don't seem to get that ideological nonsense
Mhm.
isn't it doesn't spring out of nothing, and it isn't just stupid. It springs specifically out, I believe, in most cases, of white supremacy, because
Yes.
the people they're talking about when they're imagining in their mind's eye who we're going to supply subsidies to for medical care or food stamps or wage supplements or anything like that, they are not thinking about poor white people, of which we have plenty in this country. They are specifically imagining somebody who is black or perhaps Hispanic or brown, foreign in some way, not a
Mhm.
real American.
American.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like going back to health, welfare, sorry, welfare. I combined the 2.
Right.
Um, Going back to welfare reform, the biggest, like, talking point was the welfare queen, who was, like, this, like, really gaudy, Black woman who only has children just to siphon off goods and services and money off of the government. Meanwhile, the highest population of people who are on welfare are white single mothers.
And also, I having lived among those people, I mean, I can absolutely positively guarantee you that I'm not going to say there's nobody out there ever who's done this, but I've never met anyone or even met anyone who's met anyone who seriously contemplated like, let me have another kid so I can get another $300 from the government or whatever the fuck a month.
Right, the
Like,
payoff
that's
has
not how it works.
it's
Do you
such
know how
a weird
expensive it's
payoff.
like if you want to have a child in a hospital, congratulations. Here's a bill for $80,000. Like,
Right.
like does anyone really think that like the Uncle Sam's couple $100 a month on the public dole that you have to literally scratch and claw to get? By the way, if you can even get it, is going to make up like nobody is making that calculation. And
Yeah.
this is probably I'm probably talking a little bit beyond my expertise on this, but I strongly suspect that crap, at least some of it, has its roots in the inability for Black mothers in the United States to really be mothers for a very, very long time, specifically because they were slaves. And so they didn't
Mhm.
have control of their children, their husbands, brothers, cousins, daughters, sons could be sold away from the plantation at any point. And so this weird sort of fixation by the white community as it sees itself with the reproduction of Black bodies is I think it actually it has some roots in something that old, but I can't actually draw a complete like through line. Uh,
Ooh, yeah, it's
it
like
just
you've
it
been
feels
reading.
creepy to me though. It feels like something that we've been at for a while.
Yeah, it's like you've been reading, have you read Killing the Black Body by, Dr. Dorothy E. Roberts?
I have not. I'm sorry.
You sound very informed. It's like you have read it, because these are, like, the arguments and, tracing this history. Precisely what you're saying is tracing this history, and I find that it is really hard, kind of like you were saying, to at least crystallize this because I think in our minds, I don't know if this is something that's naturalized or socialized in our own learning, but history is very linear
Right.
and contradictions don't really register. So there is something about the reproduction, I guess, politic of America around Black bodies, as you said, which is really strange.
Yeah, as
It
if like we have this tradition of considering that like they cannot be trusted or are not capable of raising a family in the same way that like a white mother is, and
exactly. So that's one part of it, and then there's also the part where they can't also partake in like abortion services. Like the reason why there's like also not
Yeah.
any Medicaid expansion is like lower income women, if they choose not to be a parent, can't even have that option. So it's just like, okay, we're gonna punish you, lower income woman of color. You have to have a child now because we have these really draconian rules around abortion and also around like access. But then when you do have the child, they punish you. Like they are like, well, why were you this irresponsible to have a child in the first place? Like it's so weird. It's so weird.
Yeah,
It's up two minds.
and that rhetoric, I think it does. You'll hear some of the same things said about poor white people, but the degree to which it occurs is just it's not anywhere near the same level. And I guess I'm speaking somewhat anecdotally in that, just but based on where I live, Georgia's about a third black,
Mhm.
and uh, my community is actually a little bit more diverse than people might expect, simply because there's a large Air Force base nearby. So there's some diversity from that, because people come from all over the country, indeed the world, to
Mhm.
work around that kind of thing. But I have heard, in the convenience store line behind me or whatever, some old bubba, talking about such and such, lazy cousin who, had too many kids. I have a cousin who lives in Alabama now. I haven't spoken to them in years.
Mhm.
I mean, I do believe that they were irresponsible with the number of children that they had, considering their economic situation and the state of her marriage, with the guy that she was with at the time. I don't even think they're still together. I believe they're separated or divorced, which, and she was planning on being a homemaker. Didn't uh, didn't really want or conceive of going into the workforce. But she, as a young white woman, does not face nearly the same stigma as a single mother, who probably chose to have too many kids. I'd say she's never going to face the
Mhm.
same level of discrimination or prejudice as a black woman would. Even a
Right.
black woman whose reasons for having kids were far more defensible to me. It doesn't even matter, because that's not how people see these things. They don't see a person there with a story who may or may not have made some mistakes, but you don't know. They see a black woman and a white woman, and that is the prism through which they examine everything. And that sort of rhetoric, I think it both has its roots in white supremacy, and in a canary-like fashion is being and will be increasingly turned towards white populations. And I think
Yeah.
you can already see this sort of with stuff like Hillbilly Elegy,
Yeah.
or anything that David Brooks has ever written about the white people of Appalachia, or
Yeah.
indeed any like elite liberal opinion columnist. The same language about like their cultural deficiencies. They just don't have the same ethics and culture that the more successful, professional, urbanized, cosmopolitan class of white people do. The same sort of faults that for years have been racialized are beginning, I think, to be transferred to poor white populations.
So I want two things. I have this theory, and I haven't hashed it out yet, and it's like I need to pull from a lot of sources. But what I think, in reading a couple of books, one of which I think is a pretty decent book, and I apologize for the title because I don't like saying this,
Sorry.
is White Trash 400 Years of
Oh, come
Racist
on.
America.
Really? That's what you were nervous about saying?
I really don't
All
like
right.
saying that.
All right. Everyone, listen
It's
up.
so dehumanizing.
Listen up. I'm I mean, you look at me, I'm pale as fuck, I'm white as fuck. Listen to my voice, I'm southern as fuck too. Both my parents born Biloxi, Mississippi. I'm giving you the white trash pass card. I hereby half of all white trash. I got some white trash in my background for sure. You can please feel free. It's fine. But
Yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go on. What
So
about the book?
so I think it's like that eternal question, especially in leftist and socialist spaces, is like, is it race or is it class? But I think it's kind of both um, playing here. And I think there was a very deliberate racialization of people who were considered white trash. So like people, like the squatters out in Kentucky, like the people who would soon like become hillbillies, and people who were, um, were in who are in Appalachia. And they were, I just want to say, like the test subjects for what the narrative we hear about Black people, because at the time, and I'm talking about like colonial on, while African bodies were being taken and being
Right,
sold into
right.
chattel slavery, that was never going to be the narrative for them, because they didn't have that kind of um footing in society. They were just chattel, and like at some points, like their value was only seen through a very economic lens, so they were probably even treated a little bit better than like poor families who, like I was saying, like were squatting and like were literally called like refuse, all of these things. These are people who probably like were indebted like back in England and had to come here to be indentured servants, or just like pretty much like in a debtor's prison. I believe that all of the language that we hear so much about, Black people being lazy, I feel like, and it's recyclable too. Like you can just put in on, like they say the same thing about Mexicans. They say the same thing about um, other groups of people, Native Americans. But I really feel like that dawning and crystallization of like um, this type of ideology and language around like degeneracy happened with poor white people, and that they're very much racialized.
Why white people specifically should give a shit about rising Black maternity and the language surrounding it is not just because, like, come on, what are you, a racist piece of shit? Everyone deserves a decent life and the ability to have kids, if they so choose. But also, like, if you don't think that this mindset is coming for you, white person, it absolutely is. I think this ideology, this language surrounding the deserving or not of socialized medicine, general welfare, any number of outcomes where the government or the public needs to get involved. It is already in the process of being turned
Yeah.
onto white people.
Yeah. So I think that the state, since its inception, really had like an opportunity to test this out on um, the most downtrodden of people in society. And at that moment, because chattel slaves were not considered human, it was poor white people who are on bottom rung. And now, as with emancipation and integration of Black people into the society, I feel like that kind of language has been transposed, but it also has a class element to it. And the same people who probably would have been really at the bottom rung in a different time period are also those same people who kind of push that kind of language, at least in like, why do we need to give certain types of people free anything, because I worked really hard for it. And they don't really see like there needs to be a class and race solidarity, and it needs to be anti-racist in terms of um, getting these kinds of things together, because it's really not just, like you're saying, it's really not just poor Black mothers who are hurting and dying. Actually, this actually crosses class lines. You know what I'm saying? It needs
Yes.
to be it needs to be very holistic in terms of being anti-classist and anti-racist, and that includes everyone to
This
be part
this
of that coalition.
this dragon absolutely needs slaying, not just because of who it's in the middle of eating in this very moment, but because like it as it eats, it will only grow. And as it
Hmm.
grows, it will come after more villages,
Exactly.
metaphorically speaking. Um, I'll talk a little bit about anti-racism though, because just to play, I'll probably do a bad job at it, but devil's advocate for a second, because I know the lib mindset pretty well. At least I try to. I read a lot of terrible libs, a lot of
Hmm.
terrible political takes,
Hmm.
and hashtag not all libs. If you're listening to this, you identify as a liberal in any way, not necessarily a shitty person. Um, I just think probably you need to go a little bit further, and then some of you are just flat out wrong about stuff. And one of those things is this. So, well, yes, I'm a good liberal, and I agree. You know, Black maternity rates are far too high, and it is absolutely a blight upon the United States of America. Um, but I'm opposed to Bernie Sanders' plan of providing socialized medicine, including maternity care, to everyone, regardless of race, because it is the Black people who really need the help the most. And we should help those who need help the most in order of priority. This is just good government and, frankly, the moral thing to do. We need justice for Black people, not justice for all. Now, I'm being a bit crude about how I say it, but I really do think that that's more or less what their mindset boils down to. And having presented it to you in such a respectful manner, Dominique, I wonder if there's anything you have to say about that kind of perspective, or if you've encountered anything like that.
Yeah. Oh, I encounter that quite often, actually. um, and I think it's a very reductionist take, and it does hint at a bit of false consciousness when you only focus on the race and racial element of it without understanding the very material thing, like the very material conditions of which race was born out of and continues to thrive. Um, and you cannot separate both of them. At the same time, I don't think that having a universal healthcare, childcare, family leave, all of those things, those are my big ones that would, in the very like immediate, help ameliorate maternal mortality and infant mortality. You cannot separate this from also doing anti-racist work, undoing white supremacy. We can do both. And I think it's disingenuous to pit one against the other, because white supremacy has built very real structures.
I also just find it like really bizarre how a lot of the same attitudes and voices who will say, look, you want Medicare for all and or Bernie's plan, you're dreaming. Even if he gets elected president, you're never going to get that, and you guys are all crazy. There's more truth to that than not. But these are the same people who then say, yeah, Congress should pass a reparations bill. Now, I want to be absolutely clear. The federal government wants to send a check to every Black person in America as reparation for slavery. I'm all for that. But I got news for those libs who like think that Medicare for all is unrealistic. That idea that the Congress would pass something like that is even more crazy to me. That's not gonna fucking happen. I can't imagine that happening in 100 years. If you really want to redistribute wealth and welfare providing in this country, I you're just white people are never going to vote for that. And that's who is in Congress. That's who specifically the white people I'm talking about, not necessarily their constituents. Like and they're backed by white people who also have a lot of money and therefore would stand to lose from this in their eyes. Uh,
Mm.
I don't understand how they can say like socialized medicine that, by the way, every other industrialized nation has already achieved before us is unrealistic in our political environment, and also Bernie Sanders isn't for reparations
Yeah,
or something like this.
I'm unfamiliar with the like nitty gritty with the reparations conversation. I know Dr. Cornel West, who is part of Bernie's
And I don't
campaign,
mean
has
and
talked about it.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but just to add quickly that while this might seem off topic, I do view sort of health justice. This is an issue of material
Yes,
redistribution that needs to occur, much like what we're talking about now. Anyway, please continue. I know it's
absolutely, absolutely. I still so the thing for me when I think about reparations is, and it's kind of come up actually within my own research about slavery, slavery, primitive accumulation of capital and reproduction, is that there there isn't really, excuse me, an amount big enough to cover the totality of not only the brutality of slavery, um, and
right.
just like overall exploitation of Black bodies and the death of Black bodies, but also there wouldn't be in a United States or a Western Hemisphere, for that matter, without both the disposition of native lands and slavery. So, like, the check would have to also include the dissolution of the United States as we currently know it, to cover
Right. If you really wanted to be just about it.
yeah,
I
like
mean,
that for me, I think that is that is the redressing of the original sin, because if the original sin is what led to the building of the country, then the repentance would have to be undoing that.
well, you've convinced me. This is now the Dissident Anarchist podcast, and I just want the state to be abolished, the whole fucking thing. How about that?
So I want it to be clear that this is kind of my line of thinking, not that I am insurrectionary at all.
No, I absolutely know what you're saying, and I've never heard that before, and that's absolutely fascinating to me. And the more I consider it, the more true that it seems. The only thing that I would add, maybe for emphasis, I mean, you did touch on this a little bit. People should recognize not just the people who live here and constitute this country, but all of the wealth, the
Yeah,
stuff
yeah,
that those bodies made that was
yeah,
then either used for something else or sold and export in some way and contributed to the growth and eventual industrialization and development of this nation. And without those bodies, the country, I mean, even if it did exist technically with the same name today, would be totally different. It would
exactly.
it would be absolutely unrecognizable to us in every way.
Right. So that's where I kind of fall in terms of reparation. I again am not saying I'm calling for like, me taking to the streets and, doing a John Brown. But
Well,
that's
at
how
least not yet.
right. But this is where I see it, and I do think that when people say we should have reparations in place of universal programs, I also don't think that universal programs is in place of reparations per se, but it is a step in the direction of actually repairing the damage and the legacies of, white supremacy, colonialism.
And I also think
And
it's the only path that has any. It's the only way it's going to happen, right?
it's
Like
it's it's
if we're
feasible
actually,
and equitable.
and I think like if we, hopefully we do get to the point as a nation where we actually do send out reparations, and even if it's clearly not really representative of the immense amount of wealth that we extracted from these people and as a country, and et cetera, it would at least like be more than just a formal recognition. It would be something of a material recognition that would
Mhm,
make that symbolic recognition of the wrong more forceful. But
mhm,
because, like you said, if we really want to talk about what's truly fair, then like it's time for the union to break up. Well, the problem is like we're not up for that.
no,
like
we
we
haven't
can't
even.
do that. So
Yeah,
all we really have is it right now is the symbol, is the dream that maybe the government will one day recognize that
yeah, I
like
mean,
it
we
was wrong.
have we have to first reckon with the actual history. And one of the things that's really frustrating for me is going back to, like, we can't process contradictions, is that there's people, and like you can kind of guess where they lean politically, who are just like, United States is revolutionary. It is a land of freedom. The Pilgrims came because of religious freedom, and we fought for this, and we're the land of liberty. How dare you like have this revisionist take that it's all built on dispossession of native lands and chattel slavery, and then I'm just like, those things can be true. Like, it could be a land of liberty for white people because that's exactly what it was.
It's so funny to hear, because I actually have another interview planned for Sunday about Shay's rebellion, which in terms
Mhm,
of historical significance, not usually considered very significant, and I think that that's wrong. In terms of military significance, not all that big, and not all that many people will end up going to the gallows for it. But it was specifically a coalition of poor yeoman farmers in the west part of Massachusetts, laborers, and also quite a few better off people who tried their hand at forging a white man's republic, not specifically on racial terms, but just because the Indians have been long removed, and there is no chattel slavery in Massachusetts at this point, and there is no United States of America, indeed, at this point, and they will organize against the oppressive taxation of Boston and as free and independent white people, and they will be absolutely crushed in every way without hesitation. And indeed, like the vitriol with the people who were alive at the time, including George Washington himself, wrote about these people. It was pretty. It, they were about as afraid of them as they were of a slave rebellion.
mhm.
Almost. In a slave rebellion in the early United States, that was like the scariest possible thing that could possibly
Right,
happen.
right.
But that is mostly a story for another day. But all that is mostly just to make the point that there will be more on the Dissident Peasant podcast about the forging of that white man's republic and its clear limitations on which white people indeed will be allowed to enjoy liberty. But
Right. Yeah, so that's the thing when we talk about history, and going back to, like, our roots and our past, as a country, we have not even gotten to that point yet. I don't know precisely how we're going to get reparations. The reparations part is like the end. We have to kind
It's
of
so
work
far away.
backwards.
I mean, but
And
for
I do
me,
want to, sorry.
no, go ahead. You please. You
I just
please.
wanted to say clearly, though, if there comes to a general consensus that like a check will be cut, I am not above it at all. Like I'm not
Oh, absolutely not.
saying like we shouldn't
Absolutely.
have reparations. I'm just like thinking through all of the avenues in which it would come by or not come by.
But I think for me, this might seem a little like almost postmodern in a negative sense, but it, if true reparations would mean or require the dissolution of the United States, this is clearly not something that we can do. And we don't really have a choice except to embrace the rhetoric of the American Revolution. I'd say in America, freedom, liberty, equity, general welfare, all this good stuff, and not just examine it for its lack of rigor and hypocrisy, but also try to make it a a reality, because as difficult as that task might seem to extend and make real in some way, as best we can, the promises of liberty and freedom for everyone in this country, regardless of what religion they practice or skin color they have or what have you. um, it, that is a tough project. What would be even harder would be, like I said, just dissolving the United States and handing over basically, almost everything that makes this country wealthy to the black population, and just like ceasing to exist. Like that's going to be even crazier. And that's really what true racial justice would probably look like. And so I humbly submit that instead, we should try to clean up a bit. Grab the broom before we grab the wrecking ball for the whole fucking house.
Yeah. Yes. I agree. I also think that in talking about like really tangible efforts to bring about racial justice, which again, to tie it in, is a key component in remedying, it's a key component in understanding um why like social determinants are terrible for Black women and Indigenous women who have really, really high rates. Um, but also in moving forward and working collectively towards, excuse me, a society that is, anti-racist, not um, post-racial. And I think that's a different conversation, but like how people kept saying, like, well, we elected a Black president, now we're like in a post-racial
Oh
um,
man, I
society,
remember
which
that.
is
I remember
very,
people
very
talking like
wrong.
that. It feels so weird, like another dimension almost, right?
Right.
Like an alternate dimension, not even like the past. It feels like another world where, but people really, not everyone and maybe not everywhere, but a lot of people did kind of talk about that. Like, I guess, racism is still going to exist, but it's crossed a sort of threshold now of importance. It's far less potent a force in our politics than it has been in the past, and you could see it in the face of our new black president with a funny name. And they really did describe the future of our politics as post-racial for a couple years at least. Crazy to think about, because now that we have like a guy, the Republicans explicitly, not to get off topic, organize, yes, around their class, but that's not, there aren't enough boat dealers in America to vote them into power. So they also need a few more or less wealthy people, and they get it explicitly by organizing around racial lines. And I think we all see that that's not just post-racial. That's fucking throwback shit. It's George
Right.
Wallace shit.
Right. It is. Oh my goodness. It. I would love to have like more of a conversation about this, just purely on like the shortcomings of like the racial imaginings of a liberal person and liberalism.
They do seem to have they seem more this is totally anecdotal. I'm kind of talking to my ass, I guess, but whatever. I'm about to shit on them anyway. I feel like a lot of them, they're almost more comfortable employing that rhetoric on, say, poor white people in West Virginia who are pretty economically left, but like have some revanchist views on gender and race. And they'll say things like, "Yeah, well, you motherfuckers, you deserve Trump. You hate black people, so that's what you get, right?" They'll say creepy shit like that, or stuff about how they're all dumb or inbred, can't get good jobs or whatever. Occasionally, they'll slip, and I do hear some white liberals, specifically more than others, talk about the black community and some of its they go into critiquing it a bit and lamenting the fact that say they're far more Christian than the population at large,
Oh yeah.
or they tend to live in a lot, not all of them, but many of them do tend to live in rural areas that are less wealthy, because a lot of them still live in the South, and Mississippi is not a rich state. Alabama, not a rich state. Georgia, we're doing better here, but not super wealthy. I don't know. I feel like they tiptoe up to that line and occasionally
Yeah,
accidentally
it's
cross over it. Like,
yeah.
say for example, accidentally tweeting out about Ben Dixon, that his sharing of that Bloomberg stop and frisk clip, getting mad about it was the ultimate white birdie bro move, and then getting totally destroyed on Twitter because the guy who shared it and found it originally was actually a black man from Atlanta, Georgia. I forget his name, a myth collector or something. I don't remember.
Yeah, I think I know who you're talking
I'm going
about.
to bring my petty Twitter grievances in here. Anyway, I've maybe gone on too long about all of this. I had one final question that I wanted to ask you, though.
Yeah.
But if there's anything you wanted to wrap up our previous conversation,
Oh
go ahead.
yeah. So I did want to say that in terms of like the shortcomings of like liberal racial politics is again just completely devoid of any kind of material analysis. But it is also something that's very facile in that like it's almost racist in a different way. It's not like
Yeah, I'm glad
KKK
you
or
said that.
like I'm gonna I'm gonna burn your house, or we're gonna make your life a living hell by throwing like
All right, can't go to my
bombs.
school with a kid or
Yeah,
whatever. Yeah,
right. It's not that kind of racism, but it's a racism paternalistic mix where like, well, we know that this group of people all have to think this certain way, and this is my projection onto them, like because black people have had all this strife, like they all think along the same lines and vote along the same lines. The same thing they do with Latinos, which is why weirdly, if I'm going to talk about like more current political news, they a lot of pundits had like lost their minds when they saw that like Bernie Sanders got 70% of the Nevada caucus vote, the Latino Nevada caucus vote. And,
right.
there was like all these like weird narratives about like, oh, maybe they don't know any better. They are the least like English speaking group of, um, you know, the electorate, which is like
Yeah,
so
excuse me.
disgustingly or like it's phrenology, it's voting phrenology.
Yeah,
Um, and I think that it's this like weird, it's like this weird way to like sidestep the really hard conversations that we need to have about race. Because they think they figured it out already, because we've had all these advancements and there's like this woke language. We had civil rights, and because they're like liberally like very socially liberal, and they're like, well, we want black people to, or like we want all people to have all these like rights, not thinking that that also includes positive rights, and
Right.
positive rights means having universal everything that will disproportionately help people of color, particularly Black people in this country. Like that doesn't factor into it. And that's why, with Canary, one of the things we want to posit is, I'm a believer in, direct action and direct action, also dual structures. But we also live in a country where, there's legislation and we have to push for legislation. So I think there's these two things that can happen. We can really organize and protest on the streets, on the ground, in the front lines, but then also we have to push for legislation that will help us in our quotidian life. So these are the two things that we want to posit in the film as to how do we really tackle this crisis? Because every year for me that goes by is a year that is just so unnecessary because so many of these deaths are preventable. And if we're going to be talking about more the structural aspect as to why people are being underserved, it's just it's mind numbing the molasses speed at which these things are happening. And I think there's a couple of things just the conversation really is more when you talk about reproductive health, it's more about reproductive rights in regards to abortion.
Right.
um
Which is obviously really important, but
yeah.
and not to cut you off, but just to be honest with you, when I first started thinking about maybe asking you to do something, it was like maternal mortality rates. First of all, I don't what do I know about that? Okay. And second of all, just kind of crudely, I'm a 34-year-old man. I don't have any kids. Or, what the fuck does this have to do with me or whatever? And but the more I thought about it, the more I thought it's actually like a really, really good angle to take because it's such a universal, not that everyone has kids, but it's such a common experience that like almost everyone at least knows somebody who's had experience with maternal care or
Mhm.
something. And even if they haven't, not to be cliche, but like children are literally the future, and we keep having them. Like this is just a really obvious and ubiquitous form of healthcare that's
Mhm.
frankly been around for a really, really, really long time because
Yeah.
people have been getting pregnant for a really, really, really long
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And because it is not just maternal care, but also health care,
It is.
viewing how it's delivered, even just setting aside for a moment abortion, um, seeing how it's delivered, access to it, equity in its outcomes is actually just as meaningful for a dude who's never going to have kids. But because so much of our, it's going to be reflective of medicine as it's more broadly delivered and practiced in this country.
Mhm.
And as we've said, uh, it's not going well.
No, it's not. Yeah, so when I'll post a lot about reproductive justice, and this is where I mean with reproductive justice is that it really looks at reproduction in a way where it's not disaggregating it, and reproduction doesn't happen in a vacuum. Also, it really champions bodily autonomy and having, again, like I was saying, positive rights and having these kinds of programs that are beneficial. Should you decide to have a child, you have these social safety nets. And should you decide not to have a child or cannot have a child, or that's just, you want to take care of your reproductive systems in general, you also have these things that we are demanding of the government to provide for us for our own general well-being. Because yeah, we can analyze it through the lens of maternal mortality, um, but it really is something much broader. And the deaths that occur with maternal mortality is kind of something that I am choosing to be kind of like the canary in the coal mine. The canary in the coal mine are these deaths. What is causing them is of interest for literally every single person, not just
exactly
mothers.
For reasons that we've, or at least that we've tried to.
Oh yeah.
For my last kind of exchange though, I want to go back to those liberals for a second, predominantly the white ones.
Okay.
And partly what I think that they do wrong, or some of them do wrong that I don't like, is that they view black people as monolith, as if, like, it is broadly speaking true, there ain't really very many black Republicans or black conservatives in America. Well, conservatives maybe, but black Republicans not so much. And they do exist, of course. It's not totally true that you'll never find one. And if you do find one, however, there's like a 1 in 2 chance that they'll probably run for like office in the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. But they do exist. I feel like they read too much into stuff like that, and they see black people as a category of people who must be approached discreetly and are themselves homogenous. And it's part of why they don't like it when there are black people who advocate for universal programs beyond their sort of like neoliberal frameworks of affordable healthcare and subsidized markets and whatnot. It's Jason Johnson saying in one breath, he's not a white liberal, of course, but he is a liberal. Bernie Sanders and his coalition, they don't care for intersectionality. And by the way, I don't care how many misfit black girls they bring out to, like, it's literally in the next breath, you just, how's your intersectionality, bro? But in any case, most of that is just prelude to this little idea that I frankly feel incredibly passionate about. I feel a little cheesy about how passionate I feel about it. I feel like maybe I'm even a bit childish about it, but here it goes. I've grown up my whole life since I was 12 anyway in Georgia, and I was very blessed. I hate to even use that word, to go to schools that were very, very racially diverse. My school was about 30-40% black, Asian students, Filipino, Hispanic, people from all over. And those are the people that, I didn't just learn with, but I grew up with. I dated them, tried to kiss them on the bus, flirt with them, all the things that kids do. And I really do think that more than anything else, that experience was more valuable than anything else in terms of how I view race and ethnicity. Because I've long come to the conclusion that a lot of liberals have that it's not enough not just not to be racist, but you must be anti-racist. Mm-hmm. But what being anti-racist looks like, what that means, now that's a little tougher. And I am not here to tell anyone definitively and orthodoxically, what they must do or should do in order to contribute to that project. But I am sure of one thing about that project, and that is that its participants must be from a multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition. And specifically, if I may be so bold, white voices in that coalition are very, very important. It is very important for the beneficiaries of a system that makes being white easier in every way, to do their best anyway, and to stand up and say, no, this ain't right, even though it's kind of good for me sometimes. It ain't right. And the reason it ain't right is not just because I care about these people over there, but I do, but also because this dragon, like I said before, it will continue to eat, and it will grow, and it will turn on those white people. It is indeed already turning on the poorer of those white people, and the same kinds of rhetorics and outcomes that we're seeing and have seen in terms of terrible statistics for maternal mortality rates, among other things. These are coming to the white community, and they're coming with that same racist ass rhetoric. It's just going to be morphed and repurposed to new populations. And that is why it is very, very, very important, not just because it's the right thing to do, but frankly for your own goddamn self-interest, if you're a white person, to get on board with this project, to say to people in your life, to try to do something, to do your best to say, I'm not just not going to be racist. I'm not just not going to say the N-word. I'm going to try to fight racism in my life and in the way I live and vote and all the rest. I don't know what you think about any of that, but that's how I feel.
Yeah, and I think, and I say this a lot in my personal life, but I think also the solidarity definitely part of the reason why you're in solidarity with someone is because you have empathy, and then you're also able to see that you are, in the same boat, and that's important for all groups of people to realize that basically liberation for one means liberation for all. And that is the goal, is to be liberated under the superstructure which we live in under, which is capitalism, that's crushing us all, white, black, brown, or whatever, what have you. Um, but also for white people doing the anti-racist work is really to do that work, because it isn't, and it shouldn't, and the onus really should not be on the people who had no say in race making, in terms of like how we are perceived as Black
Yeah,
people.
you must do the heavy lifting. Indeed, all
Right.
of the lifting. Yeah, that's just not right.
Yeah, because I have had, some spars with trolls and a couple Nazis on my old account, and I'm like, this is tiring. I don't, and at one point, really like emotionally taxing, and it hurts. It really hurts to be on that end as someone who is like, I had no say in why I'm perceived the way I am. And of course, also, white people don't have any real say in why they are privileged in the racial hierarchy, because race making, dates back to like the 1400s. You know what I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying? But as you're saying, the beneficiaries of people who are on a hierarchy maybe bone up a little bit in terms of history, and have a dialectical materialist analysis, and and fight the good fight when it comes to deprogramming yourself and fellow whites.
and I think universal programs like socialized medicine, particularly, are vehicles for this. At
Absolutely,
least
absolutely.
it's worth a try, I'd
It is
say.
worth a try. I think of fighting alongside each other for these kinds of programs, because when we talk about universal, it's literally what I mean, liberation for all. Because I say, if I eat, we all eat, and there is no, I'm going to put like myself as a Black Latino woman, you know, this kind of like supremacy based on race, because that's not subverting the whole race and class thing. That's literally just making it so that oppressive figures have a different face, and that's not what I want. I literally want these structures that oppress us all to be undone by the work of us all.
Exactly, because we really, like I said before, just to sum up, the white man's republic, that as a vehicle, even for the white people, I got news for you, it ain't gonna work. Okay, and
It's not going to work because
I'll talk more about that on Sunday. But what's also not going to work is the other thing that we talked about earlier, which is that, hey, look, if we're really talking about justice and fairness, we're going to have to break this whole damn country up, because the whole thing was built by slave labor and taking land from the indigenous people. So like both of those, either creating a white ethno state or just abolishing the whole thing, we can't do either one of them things, okay? At least not yet. So we don't really have a choice but to try to take this weird ass, rickety old country that we got here, who, that does need some work and is a pretty racist place. We got to try to make it something better.
Absolutely.
That's the only thing that we can do.
Yeah. What I was gonna say about, the white man's like is just that like even among white people, and this actually kind of floored me, is that there's so many like microaggressions and like micro like racialization and like who is considered like a good white and like some people like I've heard people say things about eye color, even skin color, and I'm like, what are we talking about? This is so strange. So like even within like, oh, white man's republic, it will just turn inward and you'll start picking off all of these other people who you just don't deem as the white right, because that kind of solidarity, it's not even solidarity, it's just
I'm gonna let you know a secret.
Mhm.
I'm doing my part here. I married a non-white person. She's Polish, of course, so she doesn't count.
Oh.
I actually think about that a lot though, because 100 years ago, she would not have been considered white.
Right. Yeah, it's so
Damn
strange.
paler than me. She's so much paler than me.
It's so strange when I sometimes, not that I'm in these like conversations and I'm hearing like white people pick on other white people, but it's just like there is a weird like common, or I would say like a casual prejudice even within racial groups, and that goes all across the board, like um that happens with all kinds of racial groups, but like it's very strange to hear it among white folks because of the way the hierarchy is set up.
It is a little bit, I think it's a little bit revealing and useful, as funny as it is though, just because it shows that like whiteness itself is just a mental construct. It is just a category that people have created. It doesn't really
And it's not
have,
tenable either.
yeah, it doesn't really have any like biological basis that's rigorous in any way, or any scientific like sort of reason why we do it. And you can tell precisely because who gets to be white is always changing. It changes pretty slow, but it does change. You can clearly see it over time. That's another reason why, like, forging a white ethno state is not going to be a vehicle for liberation, even for them white people, because that's one way the system takes care of itself. It gets to decide who's white and who's not.
Right.
That's pretty much all I got for you, Dominique. Remy, if there's anything you'd like to say in
I
conclusion, I would give you the
really
floor.
appreciated this, to be honest, because I've done I've done a lot of reading about these kinds of dynamics. But when I'm talking about film, it doesn't, it's just so broad when we talk about reproductive justice, and there's so many things I have to hit. I don't really get a chance to like luxuriate on like these kinds of politics that are underlying specific policies that make it really terrible for people to have good care and like tiered care in this country because of the commodification of healthcare. So like it was really great to talk about like all these other aspects that I don't normally explore.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, and hopefully, maybe we'll do it again sometime if you're up for it.
I would love, because there's no whole like part of the film is really tracing the professionalization of gynecology and obstetrics on plantations. That is something I've talked about. But talking about these like broad, more abstract things in terms of like race and and politics in the United States and class consciousness, um, and making it very concrete and bringing it down a little bit. That is a little bit harder, especially to put into film. So I do appreciate having that ability to talk about how these things also affect healthcare, because like people just really distill healthcare as to something really tangible, like, oh, if I have a cold, I go
Right.
to the doctor, which is like, no, healthcare is like, it's like life or death for a lot of people. It's why people work in certain places. It's why people have jobs. It's why people stay in certain situations. Like, we don't even
Why some people stay married, which is really creepy to
exactly.
think about.
Right. So, like, these are things that aren't talked about, and taking the lens of reproductive justice and reproductive care in general, um, allows me to also talk about all these all these factors. So yeah, I we are currently with the film. Um, we are currently in production mode. So because the rates are pretty high here where I am based in New York, in Brooklyn, the central Brooklyn specifically, the rates are high in
It
terms
costs
of
for everything pretty high.
yeah, and it's really high. So it's like 4 times more likely in Brooklyn, in the Bronx, also 3 times more likely for Black and Latina women. So we have been able to, go to these communities and get footage and conduct interviews, which has been awesome. But because I want to have a comprehensive look at the rates across the country, we will be expanding the film to have multiple states. One of the states that will be figuring pretty heavily, other than New York, is actually going to be Georgia and
Mhm.
California. So we will make a stop in Georgia. But to do that, because this is an independent film project, when I don't have a studio, and I have no studio or production backing, save for myself and my colleagues. We are at the stage where we're asking for in-kind support by way of seed funding, so we can really get off the ground, at least for the first half of the film project.
Folks, there will be a link in the notes to this. The film is Canary, a
Hmm.
film by Dominique Remy and what is it, Mashida Phillip? Is that how you say the name?
Shida.
Mashida, pardon
Mhm.
me, Mashida Phillip.
That is
We've
very
talked.
close. Very close on the first Shida.
I totally was trying to wing it. I should have asked before I tried to pronounce it, but no, I'm leaving it in. Folks, there's a link to this in the notes. Please, if you have extra money, you should give it to me. But if you have even more extra money after that, give it to Dominique Remy. I'm kidding. Everyone,
Yes,
go give
$5
money
goes
to
a long
Dominique
way.
Remy. Yeah, every little bit helps, and more importantly, if you know anyone who's interested in this film project, maybe share it around to them. Maybe share it on social media. Because folks, I think that this is a really, it might seem a sort of narrow issue, but this is the kind of stuff that can be a lens through a great change in our politics in this country, one that we're fighting for right at this very moment. I think Dominique is fighting for right at this very moment. And so if you check that out, I know she would appreciate it. And I too would personally appreciate it because Dominique Remy is a friend, comrade of mine, and I want to thank her very much for her time and attention today, Dominique. Thank you.
Thank you so much.